Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today we're going to Chernobyl. Only, thank goodness, we don't really have to go to Chernobyl. We can do it vicariously through our guest who knows the place pretty well and the surroundings very well. This is Kate Brown, who's a history professor at MIT and who speaks Russian and knows Russian. So that was a big asset for her research, which produced a book a couple of years ago. Can't remember the title. Kate, what's the title of your book?
Manual for Survival, a Chernobyl Guide to the Future.
Good. Well, it was a terrific book. And before that, you had a book with I think, more memorable title, Plutonium or
Plutopia.
Yeah, a wonderful title that described the risks of living around a place such as Hanford, Washington, where the plutonium pits for American nuclear weapons were produced. And it was not a healthy place. Okay, so let's get down to business, Kate, because I know you've got to rush off and do other things today. Tell me about your book. I'm going to let you do most of the guidance since you know what you need to cover on this. Let me say this much. Before I read your book, I had heard estimates about how many people had been killed in the Chernobyl disaster, ranging from, I think, 20 or something like that to 1 million. So it's someplace in that vicinity, which is one hell of a wide swathe of population to try to, well, what kind of an estimate is that? But you are in a position to actually look at documents that probably would have been ignored by the rest of the world who didn't speak Russian, right? And talk to people. So what did you find out and what did you conclude? And what is this a healthy environment around there, or what's the situation?
Well, that was one of my main questions is, we have this large range of possible fatalities from Chernobyl. We know definitely 33 firemen and nuclear plant operators died. And a lot of the UN documents have this range between 33 and 54 dead from Chernobyl. And then, a couple thousand kids with easily treatable, they would say, thyroid cancer. And then Greenpeace and other organizations had much higher counts, up to like 900,000 potential people who would eventually die. So I worked, I thought I would go into the first Ministry of Health Archives of the Soviet Union and try to figure out if I could get, just a sure answer about, fatalities and the public health impact. I also wanted to know about the environmental impact. So I worked my way through about 27 archives for this story, because as I got into the archives in Kiev, and then I moved on to the provincial archives and to the national archives in Moscow, and then over to Belarus, and did the same sort of up and down the ranks of government bureaucracies, I was finding a pretty disturbing story of people on the ground who were mostly doctors and radiation monitors. And they were saying, we don't know. There are no we have no maps of radiation and where it's spread. And we're told that everything's fine. And we're told that our food is fine. But what we see is a troubling uptick in the frequencies of diseases among the populations that live in our areas. And they start sending these letters in, to Kiev. And then, Kiev usually cleans them up and sends them up to Moscow. And I see this correspondence starting to happen right, within a couple of months of the accident. The official count is 300 people were hospitalized after the accident. That was just a number from one hospital, and that hospital was a special radiation medicine hospital in Moscow, where they brought the most acute cases. But not 300, but my count is 40,000 people were hospitalized from Chernobyl exposures in the summer after the accident, and about a quarter of these people 11,000 of them were children. As time goes on, and I thought, well, how are they getting these exposures? And so I went into the Ministry of Agriculture records, and I found that though Moscow officials said, we've tested the food and we found the food is safe, is that in classified documents, they're finding radiated food all the way up and down the food chain. Pretty much everywhere where humans congregated, they brought with them radioactive isotopes from the surrounding countryside and the forests into the villages and towns where they lived. And so places of human habitation became sort of epicenters because of human activity. Humans take what they find in the larger environment, they bring it to where they live. Because of that and because of the food sources. So people were taking in chronic levels, low dose levels of radioactivity. So this makes for a very different situation from Hiroshima. Hiroshima was counted as one big X-ray, and the atomic bomb survivor studies calculates this sort of less than a millisecond of exposure of gamma rays going through people's bodies, and then those gamma rays keep going. And they count the damage that that millisecond of gamma rays in the bodies caused. So when UN officials came in the late 1980s and early 1990s and said, we're looking at these doses these people are receiving, because they held up Geiger counters, they looked at the gamma rays coming from the soils and coming from the trees. And these doses are far lower than the Hiroshima doses. So therefore, we don't expect to see any health problems.
They were counting gamma. Excuse me. They were counting gamma rays in the trees,
in the ambient environment. They would hold a Geiger counter up and say, this village has, kind of, like what you'd find if you flew in an airplane, that kind of stuff. But what was different about Chernobyl from Hiroshima was that people were eating radioactive substances in their food. Just incredible. It was in the milk, it was in the meat, it was in the wheat, the honey, the tea, the backyard vegetables, you name it, in the water people drank. They tracked it in the mud, as they went inside, so it was in the air, it was in the dust. So this is the kind of situation that we really had no existing large-scale health studies to measure. So they extrapolated to Hiroshima, but that was sort of a false level of comparison. And over and over again, Belarusian and the Ukrainian medical people and the scientists kept saying, but you have it wrong. You're not listening to us. We have all these kids here after 3 years, and then 4 years, especially with thyroid cancer. We used to never have thyroid cancer among children. And now we have, 20 in Ukraine and 30 in Belarus. And then the next year, 100 and 200. And the numbers kept growing like that. The international community, as the Soviet Union fell apart, the international community took over assessing the health and environmental consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. And as they came in, first, the World Health Organization came in, and within 2 weeks, they said, we don't see any problems. Nobody took that assessment seriously. So then Moscow invited the International Atomic Energy Agency in. Now, the IAEA is set up to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So they're a lobbying organization. And they knew, they're like, if we do an assessment, nobody will believe us because we're a nuclear lobby. So they created a interagency committee called the International Chernobyl Project, which the IAEA led, but it looked like a more neutral organization, the International Chernobyl Program, an interagency UN project. And so they went in and they did, studies, and they ran them against the Hiroshima data and published this report in 1991 that said, 33 people died. We don't see any, the people on the ground are not healthy, but we don't think their health problems are related to Chernobyl exposures. It's probably psychological stress that's causing their problems. We recommend two things not happen that were in the works to happen. The UN was raising money to move 200,000 people from Chernobyl contaminated areas because local doctors on the ground were saying we're seeing this tremendous series of health problems, problems related to the thyroid and the endocrine system, circulation system, digestive tract disorders, autoimmune disorders, and birth defects.
Now, were these primarily cancers or other?
No, these are like subacute effects. Like that's the other problem with the Hiroshima studies is they only look for acute effects, deaths and cancers that cause death. But people were getting sick with sort of chronic ailments that really cause daily life to be miserable, but they weren't dying, immediately from them. They would linger on with these problems. We find that people live on average, the one study that's looked at this, about 15 years shorter lives than everybody else in Ukraine and Belarus. So they're not dying immediately from it, but the quality of life is pretty miserable. And so, like, what we have is charts at the county level that shows before 1986, the Soviet medical system would look at every kid and they'd say 80% of the kids are in the healthy category and 10 to 20% have some chronic illness or another. After 1987, those numbers flip, and what we see is 80% to 90% of the kids have one or two chronic health problems, and 10 to 20% are deemed healthy by Soviet metrics. So this is big, so these are the kinds of things people are getting really alarmed about. And so they wanted to move people to safer ground. 200,000 people, big movement. Originally, they only moved 120,000 people, so almost double that number are going to be moved again. And Belarus and Ukraine are asking the UN for monetary help in the form of $1 billion in today's money to move these 200,000 people and to carry out a long-term, large population health study of Chernobyl survivors based on this idea of chronic low doses of exposure. So they wanted to do a Hiroshima type study, but in this different radiation context. The IAEA study, they rushed it so that it came in before that pledge drive went in the General Assembly of the UN. And they rushed it and they said, listen, we don't see any reason to fund these projects. We see no health problems. We don't think we'll see any in the future, except maybe a tiny bump of kids with thyroid cancer in the future. At the time, they had biopsies of kids who had thyroid cancer in the present, but they didn't acknowledge. They said, we've heard stories of thyroid cancer, but those stories, the publication says, are anecdotal in nature. So I went on to work in about 5 UN agencies.
But I can only ask, what was going on at that point? Was there some kind of, I don't know, vested interest or something? This is the group of investigators who were set up by and accountable to IAEA, right? So in a way, they had their loyalties.
But that's a great question, Meta. What's going on at the time is a great question, because here we are at the end of the Cold War, and what happened at the end of the Cold War is that there's no longer reasons to keep the same kind of vigilance on nuclear secrets. So Yeltsin starts it, 1992. He opens the Soviet archives and says, take a look at what we've got here. Look at the Soviet record. The Americans start too, opening their nuclear archives, and the Department of Energy is forced by protesters, and starting in the mid-1980s, to release and declassify documents. Same thing's happening in Great Britain. So all of a sudden, all these people are coming to their governments, and they're saying, look at this record. I was living downwind from the Nevada test site. I was living near the Hanford plutonium factory. I was living next to in Algeria, where the French were testing. I was living in Western Australia, where the British were testing nuclear weapons. And I feel like my health problems are due to those exposures. Mm-hmm. And so lawsuits, billions in dollars potentially of lawsuits are popping up like mushrooms after a rain. And so the Association of American Health Physicists met a year after Chernobyl in 1987, right out here, Washington, right outside of Washington, D.C. And health physicists are people who deem, if nuclear reactors are safe, and if, people who work in reactors have had exposure. So they're sort of they're the people who do this. And so they were meeting to have their annual professional conference, business as usual, but they were met, and a keynote was given to them by a lawyer from the Department of Energy. And he said, the biggest threat to nuclear power today is not another accident like 3 Mile Island 7 years ago and Chernobyl last year, but lawsuits. And so these health physicists went into breakout groups, and they were schooled by Department of Justice lawyers to learn how to become effective witnesses on behalf of the US government to defend against lawsuits, and to be under the guise of objective scientists.
That is just appalling.
So that's the context.
And you're talking about, did the whole profession sort of line up behind the government in this, or?
Well, not everybody,
case of individual corruption, or what kind of thinking went on among people who are professionals supposed to be looking after the public health, who are is so easily persuaded to lie, if that's what the implication is of what you're saying?
I'm not saying that they lied. I'm saying that they were strongly encouraged and schooled to have a certain particular kind of response. And if you think about this time, I mean, where do health physicists work? They usually work for some facet of nuclear industries or nuclear regulatory agency, or they work in a government agency. So there are very few independent scholars who work on these issues. A couple stepped forward: Steve Wing at the University of North Carolina, David Richardson, also an epidemiologist, Rosalie Bertle, she wrote to the UN and said, I'm willing to help. But those letters went unanswered. These people were not tapped. They tapped into people who already were sort of industry scientists.
Mm.
So they also had another motivation, in addition to losing biopsies or overlooking evidence, which is that they've been working for decades with these Hiroshima models, which were manifest in these charts. And these charts said, if you got this certain exposure, you had this percentage of extra percentage of getting cancer, 0.05, 0.02% of getting cancer in the future. And they worked with these models. And they, if you worked in radiation diagnostics, you gave people CAT scans, you gave people X-rays, you gave people radioactive iodine just to cure their cancers. So to suddenly flip around and say, oh gosh, we've been giving people these doses of radiation thinking it was safe, and now to suddenly have to change the science that was behind those parameters, that risk management strategy, was just a big intellectual leap to take. And it took a long time. It took them until 1996 to recognize a huge epidemic of childhood thyroid cancer in Ukraine and Belarus and Western Russia. They finally had to say, yeah, the Belarusian doctors were right when they were talking about this problem in 1989. There is a big epidemic of thyroid cancer. And it came quicker than we realized, quicker than our stated latency period, and it was much more powerful of an effect. So this is the kind of, science is slow, science is conservative, and maybe that's good. So I don't want to accuse them of lying. I think that they believed in their science, and they believed in the goodness and the value of their knowledge, and to have it upset by Chernobyl. And then, on the part of scientific administrators who often direct scientists, who pay their bills and give them tasks, who release or don't release the studies that they do, the scientific administrators could mobilize Chernobyl. They could say, look, Chernobyl, world's worst nuclear accident, and only 55 people died. We can handle, as Burton Bennett said, of the UN, we can handle that kind of damage and go forward into the nuclear, into a beautiful nuclear future. So Chernobyl became this really critical, deposition lawyers working for plaintiffs looked for Chernobyl studies to try to make their case in court. Health physicists, working on the behalf of these governments, looked for rival Chernobyl studies in order to make their case in court about people being exposed in bomb tests, people being exposed at bomb production facilities. So Chernobyl was this critical point. What I found as I did my research is that about this question of fatalities, the Belarusian and Russian governments have published no records about neither casualties or fatalities related to Chernobyl. There's just almost nothing out there. Ukraine got the least amount of Chernobyl radiation, but they do have some numbers. One number is they give compensation to 35,000 women whose husbands died with a Chernobyl-related illness. That's 35,000. That's a very limited number because it just includes men who were old enough to marry and who were married and who had documented exposures. It includes no children. It includes no women in that count. In the 2016 30-year anniversary of Chernobyl, Ukrainian officials said that they estimated 150,000 Ukrainians had died. And that's one republic out of three that was heavily hit with Chernobyl. They got 20% of Chernobyl radiation in Ukraine, 80% went to Belarus and Western Russia. So somewhere between 35,000 and 150,000 is the minimum low count for Chernobyl fatalities.
So you could do some arithmetic and multiply the population size of Belarus and Russia, the areas that were exposed, and how much radiation they got, and do some, some estimates, right?
Yeah, somebody good at math should do that.
Yeah, I think grade school math would do it. Sure, I could, but a 10th grader could certainly do it. Okay, so who did do that? Has anybody actually made? No. Well, I know that there's some kind of document that's in Russian that was published, some tiny excerpt or synopsis was published in a US journal. And I'm sorry, I don't remember any more than that, but that it was, they gave I remember the figure. It was like, these people were estimating 1 million total deaths. What am I referring to? Because my memory is weak.
That was the Yablokov study done with, Alexander, the late Alexander Yablokov did was to compile all the studies in the Russian language related to Chernobyl, and he kept this growing compendium. It was published under the New York State National Endowment of Humanities, and that estimate comes from that publication from about 2006, I think. Mm-hmm. And he kept updating it until he just died a couple of years ago. He kept updating it throughout his life. So that's like all sort of public peer-reviewed, in the Russian context, peer-reviewed work in Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian. And that's where that 900,000. Okay. And that was Greenpeace also supported that.
Of course, I've heard people say that that's not a credible source, but what do you think? Is that what kind of numbers should one pay attention to, or how many of them would you pay attention to?
Well, I didn't use that source because it's been so maligned. So what I used were archival records that really sort of was the data that fed many of those papers that were done by Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian scientists. And so I could check, tracking them through the archive, I could check as they were being created, as these studies were, they first formed the studies and they gathered the data. I could check the data. I could see what they've then accomplished. So it's sort of like, if the papers in those Yablokov studies are sort of the end result, what I was looking at was all the supporting work that led up to it. And I mean, they were there, this is a very valuable font of knowledge. I think more researchers should go into these archives because what it does is it records, for the first time in human history, we have a record of what happens to people when they're exposed 24/7 to chronic low doses of radiation. And, the Hiroshima studies started 5 years after the bombing. They only formed, this AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, only started to fund this in 1950, and they were slow. So like some people might have been asked about their exposures 10 years after the bombing. Here we have these Chernobyl records where radiation monitors and doctors are on the ground gathering information within weeks of the accident. And then they keep doing that. And all of that raw data is stored in the Soviet archives. It's extremely valuable.
And you could go see it.
Anybody can go see it.
I mean, you could read it. I couldn't. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Good. Now, I have heard a couple of questions. One is I have heard that the WHO is in some sense compromised by its power relationship vis-a-vis IAEA, that the WHO has done no significant amount of real evaluation of the health effects, or can't be trusted for the work it's done, because they are not really allowed to do the kind of research that they should be doing because it's supposed to be all in the bailiwick of the IAEA. Can you comment on that? Is that true? And what should be done about it?
Well, supposedly there's an agreement, a memorandum of understanding in which the World Health Organization cedes authority on nuclear medicine to the International Atomic Energy Agency. I didn't find any sign of that memorandum. Not that I had full access, especially IEA, I had very limited access to records. But what I did see is that the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency got into a skirmish because both World Health said we should be deciding on assessments on Chernobyl and health because we're the health people. And the IEA said, well, we're the radiation and nuclear people, we should decide. The IAEA basically won that battle because they were ranked higher in the UN family of nations. They had a higher status, they had more money. In fact, they had so much money that the UN Scientific Committee for the Effects of Radiation, it's supposed to be an independent body that looks at the effects of radiation on human health, were basically sort of detailed, inside the IAEA. The IAEA gave them funding, they circulated staff through UNSCEAR. And when, people who worked at the UN said, these two agencies are basically merged, we should just formally merge them. And they're saying this, in the second half of the 1980s and early 1990s, they're like, no, we need to have UNSCEAR appear to be an objective, independent body, separate from the IAEA. So that's how things work. There's a lot of, like at any time and place, things will, there's politics, like in any human agency. If you look at the IAEA's website now, they have a lot to say about cancer, Zika virus. They do, one of their, sort of part of their portfolio now is health. And it kind of fascinating, transformation of that agency from just focusing on reactors and other sort of nuclear policies to getting into the business of health.
And would their estimates now be more accurate, you think? Are they telling it straighter than they used to?
I don't see any sign of that.
No? You still think that there's still some kind of...
No, they haven't updated their documents. Everybody, quotes a 2006 document, 15 years old, with gives these projected casualties into the future. All that work. We have more information now. We have, we need to have funding for a study. Mm-hmm. Until that happens, and it's not too late to do a long-term study on the effects of Chernobyl exposures. But certainly those old documents, referring to those old documents from 2006, highly political, doesn't make any sense.
So what we should be demanding is some kind of new effort to start telling the truth, not just about Chernobyl, but about the whole business of exposure to radiation, right? And how many people have been affected by it in the world, I mean, one of my dear friends, Doug Saunders, just wrote an article in the Globe and Mail saying, we've drawn the wrong conclusion about Fukushima because Fukushima shows nobody has died and it's really an okay thing. Have you looked at any of that? And by the way, I mean, the Fukushima thing, I suppose if the effects are at all there, they would occur more like the effects of Chernobyl than of Hiroshima, because people would be affected by ingestion of the radiation more than a sudden blast of it.
Yeah,
is that right?
What I've learned, I have not looked into Fukushima because I'm an empiricist and I believe in working in primary sources and working in the language of a place. So I don't know Japanese, so I haven't. I mean, I've read what you read, in the English language press, but I haven't looked into that. What I've become convinced is that every nuclear event is really its own particular incident that may or may is less easy to extrapolate from event to event. That way, that each needs to be studied separately because ecologies, the nature, the cocktail of radioactive toxins, and the kinds of bodies that are exposed are all original. They're all quite unique.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, I do have to go. So
Okay. All right. And it's been very enlightening, and you are good at talking, getting it out there quickly. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a great day, Kate.
All
It's,
right.
it's lovely to see you again.
You too, Meta. Take care. Bye bye.